Hello and welcome to Negotiating Government, the podcast with Negotiant. I am Miranda Worthington and I am an associate here with Negotiant, and I was previously the Department of Health and Social Care's Director of Industrial Relations through the NHS strikes. And I am here with Josh Flax.
Hi, this is Josh Flax. I'm a founding partner here at Negotiant, and all of us here have a pretty robust interest in high public impact negotiations, what helps them succeed, and what happens when they go wrong. And so with that in mind, we've been looking at strikes and work stoppages. And this podcast is our second in a series on that subject.
Yeah, and so we're going to do a short podcast today focusing on a case study, the Screen Actors Guild or SAG-AFTRA strike, which lasted from July to November in 2023. And we're going to pull out some of the interesting features of that strike to talk about them.
The other thing we're going to do is ask the question, why do well-intentioned negotiators sometimes pursue potential disaster scenarios, which lose both sides money? On the surface, when you look at the numbers and the situation, it shouldn't be that way. And yet, it seems to be a feature of industrial labor relations in both the United States, the United Kingdom, and lots of countries with similar industrial labor relations systems. Some conflict at the workplace gets to a point where the parties willingly and voluntarily throw their arms around each other, jump off the cliff together, and light on fire huge cartloads of cash. And this is an interesting topic for us. What would make people voluntarily choose to entertain such a disastrous scenario?
Great. So first, let's cover a little bit of the background on the strike. Josh, can you tell us a little bit about how the strike came about and what it was and what people were striking about?
Sure. This strike was coming for a long time, and everybody could see, if not a work stoppage or a strike coming, everybody who followed the industry, as well as the general public, could see that the industry had a major problem. And the problem was mainly this in two parts. Thing one is that the rise of AI and of computer-generated graphics for television and movies in some ways seem to obviate the need for actual actors to perform those roles. This is a major problem for actors who are members of the Screen Actors Guild. And additionally, the other problem everyone could see coming was what we call the residuals from streaming. And essentially, this means who makes the money every time a television viewer out there accesses the back catalog in Netflix of these and such television shows or movies. And of course, those are copyrighted protected material that they're streaming off of Netflix due to their membership. Who's making the money from all of those additional viewings of that proprietary content?
And had they made attempts to negotiate before the strike started?
Yeah, they started loosely about a year before the strike started. And of course, there's a long history of trade unionism in Hollywood and in this particular industry, not just in Hollywood, obviously in New York and other places where the industry has a huge amount of production. And so the trade unionism goes back about almost 100 years by now in an attempt by the actors to break the old studio system, which was essentially a monopolist employer, and it kept wages down. And so the idea of trade unionism in Hollywood and in the industry in general in the United States, in the UK as well, of having trade unions for the actors, for all of the people involved in creating television and film production in order to try and level the playing field with the studios is a long tradition in that industry.
And actually, that's a helpful segue to the question I was going to ask you next, which is who is it who is going on strike? I think everyone hears about the very famous people who are striking, Bryan Cranston, Jennifer Aniston, and so on. But presumably there's a number of actors who aren't household names who are participating in this.
Yeah, so it's in terms of the actors, you've got all your name brand actors who are the biggest draw and making the most money. They were all walking the picket line with the rest of the union members of the Screen Actors Guild. So do all the screen actors make that kind of money? And absolutely not. And Jennifer Aniston and Bryan Cranston did not need to walk the picket line in order to affect their personal bank balances. This is actually about the many thousands of members of the Screen Actors Guild who don't headline television and film production. They're all of the extras. They're all of the smaller roles. They're all of the other actors that are required to make a scene work and make a production work. But they earn what's called scale, and they earn essentially a base wage that is covered in the collective bargaining agreement. And the old collective bargaining agreement didn't really have robust provision for those actors who are not name brand to share in the benefit of continual viewing of content over streaming platforms such as Netflix, Hulu, Paramount, and others.
So was it just actors? What about the wider filmmaking teams?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Miranda. Sure, it was just the actors who were technically on strike, but of course, it takes more than actors to make a television or film production sing and be successful. Of course, there's carpenters and set builders, there's camera operators and sound, microphone, and boom operators, makeup artists, caterers, drivers, security, movers. You name it. And many of those folks have their own labor union representation, and many of them don't. But the point is the actors are just a small percentage of the sheer number of employees and staff that are necessary for overall film production and TV production. So if the actors go out on strike, all of those other types of workers are unable to work.
So in a way, there's collateral damage in the fallout between the actors and the management side.
Yeah, and the collateral damage from this work stoppage, from this strike in 2023 was absolutely huge. And the costs are estimated in the billions of dollars because all of those people are out of work, not just the actors and not just the production crews that work for the studios. There was no production possible at all. And remember, some of these productions, even if you just had a 3 to 4 month strike, you can't just flip the switch as soon as the strike is over and have production resume the very next day. There were weeks and months more of delay to get all of these productions back up and running and back up on schedule. And so that's produced at least a 6 to 8 month delay in production schedules. And many careful viewers have estimated that a lot of television and film release was delayed by up to a year due to this 3 to 4 month strike.
Wow, that's remarkable. And I suppose points back to your opening comment that it seems in nobody's interest for these huge losses that affect actors, management side, and the other participants, other people involved in the filmmaking process to lose out on a lot of revenue.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the question that we want to dive into today. What is the incentive structure at work, or the cognitive biases at work that actually cause people in a particular industry, in this case a very, very successful industry that was making a huge amount of money, what would cause them to entertain the idea of a work stoppage? Why would everybody say, oh, we're willing to go along with a scenario where actually we shut down all of production for 3 to 4 months, generating 6 to 8 to 12 months worth of delay in film and television release, which essentially is like taking giant piles of cash and just lighting them on fire.
And presumably part of the answer to that question is that when the union started considering strike, they thought that they were unlikely to actually go on strike. And when they went on strike, they thought they were unlikely to stay on strike for over 100 days, which is how long it ended up being. So they never imagined, or hopefully they never imagined, that the losses would be so huge.
Yeah, I mean, what happens in the collective bargaining universe, especially with this amount of money involved, is that both parties feel like they have a fairly righteous position. They may even feel that they have a little bit of movement and they want to see what movement the other party has at the negotiating table to try and resolve the conflict. However, the more one party hears from the other party, no, we're not willing to do that, whatever that is, both parties might start to think about whether some kind of protracted labor dispute is actually going to achieve their goals. And that was the question that the union leaders for SAG-AFTRA had to decide for themselves, since they were the ones that initiated the strike. The question was, if they continued negotiations the way they were going, would they make critical gains in the collective bargaining agreement on these two big questions of sharing of residuals from streaming, and also who controls the computer-generated content, and what happens if an actor, likeness, voice, or both are generated, right? And these were the questions that still needed to be resolved. And the union's initial public position was that negotiations will resolve these questions, and if they don't, or at least resolve them somewhat to our satisfaction, and if they don't, we will consider a work stoppage or a strike.
I suppose we can't really comment on the specifics of what was going on for both sides in this case, not least because we don't know. But the fact that the strike was so long does suggest that both sides, perhaps a cognitive bias had crept in, and both sides were digging in a way that made it very difficult to reach a conclusion. And I suppose what springs to mind for me is the sort of sunk cost fallacy, where once you've crossed the Rubicon, you've gone on strike, it becomes actually more difficult to compromise than it would have been before you went on strike. And you feel like, having done that, you need to see greater gains from the negotiation. If both sides feel like that, you can actually move further apart rather than moving closer to an agreement.
Yeah, this goes to the question of leverage in negotiation, right? And a small or a medium amount of leverage that you bring to the negotiating table ideally will be deployed to try and keep the other party at the table with you, and both parties making progress, each party making some gains in areas that are important to them, and perhaps making some concessions in other areas that are less important to try and reach agreement. The interesting thing about collective bargaining negotiations is that the parties, in addition to having lower level and medium levels of leverage, they also have a thermonuclear destruct button, which is the work stoppage. And in the United States, that can either be initiated by the union when they go on strike, or
Yeah.
initiated by the employers when they institute what's called a lockout. Either way, once one side pushes the button, it's like putting a reset on the entire collective bargaining process. Everything has changed, to your point, Miranda, which is excellent. And it doesn't matter up until the work stoppage whether the parties have been negotiating already for days or months or even years. Once one party or the other pushes the destruct button and the work stoppage begins, the dynamics change completely. And your point about this bias that starts to creep in is incredibly valuable. In economic terms, what we're talking about here is the sunk cost, which is the amount of money and resources and time and everything that the parties have already sunk into these negotiations and not make the progress that they want. And instead of treating those sunk costs as exactly that, as sunk, they start to enter into what we call the sunk cost fallacy, meaning those costs, even though they've already been spent and they've already mounted, start to take center stage. And one party or both parties start to feel like all of the resources they've already spent on these negotiations, in fact, merit just chucking in more resources going in the same direction, that eventually they'll recover somehow and get back to a baseline, which of course is not going to happen when the negotiations blow up.
Yeah, and in fact, often what you need to do in that circumstance is disregard what's already been spent and think purely about what is achievable in the future and how to get the best outcome at the lowest cost.
That's exactly right. Let's also not forget to add in our discussion something about the leverage. And Miranda, when we've talked about this in the past, you've made the really excellent point that the moment of greatest leverage for parties in a collective bargaining agreement is actually before they blow up the negotiations with a work stoppage, not afterward. Do you want to say something more about that?
Well, yeah, that's absolutely right. I think it is most often the case that the incentive, assuming that it's the union about to press the destruct button and go on strike, the moment where management side is most incentivized to do a deal and potentially most likely to be more generous is just before that happens, when the threat of it is greatest and the chance of averting it is there. Once it's happened, I think management side tends to adopt a slightly different attitude and see its benefits and losses through a different lens. and the threat of strike is no longer there. It's actually happening, and so it feels like something that needs to be avoided less acutely.
I think that's exactly right. And this is the piece of where the stop loss bias comes in. After the work stoppage has already started, one or both parties might be more likely to say, oh, well, we've made a bet and it doesn't seem to be working out very well right now, but I'm sure it will one day. So let's keep making bad bets and hold on to our current position. And that dynamic tends to be exacerbated after the work stoppage has been called. One of the things I love about the differences between our two countries separated by a common language, as the old expression goes, is that sometimes you have a really nice way of describing things that isn't widespread in the US. So, for example, you've often described a work stoppage as a burning platform. That is to say that once you initiate the work stoppage, you're literally burning up the wooden platform that you yourself are standing on. Um, there's no more incentive. There's nothing that's going to keep you secure because you're about to lose your perch.
And actually, I suppose one more thing to say on this is that being able to negotiate effectively is not dependent on, but it's certainly helped by having good relations between the parties. And once that destruct button has been pressed, it becomes much more difficult for the parties to have collaborative conversations because there's a degree of whether it's sort of trust or trust being broken or increased antagonism that is not beneficial.
I know in one of our earlier conversations, you've said it really brilliantly. I'm going to quote you back to you. You said the trick is about looking forward at what you stand to win or lose rather than looking back at what you have already lost. In this case, the employers were not in the dark about what was going to happen if there was a work stoppage, and yet they still failed to improve their offer. So they were going to lose billions of dollars as well if there was a work stoppage. And yet they carried on that same path.
Yeah, and I guess there's a few things that spring to mind. One is a sense of people have a very strong sense of fairness, and actually they would rather earn slightly less, but in a context, but it feel fair. And so if stopping work to get to the point where an agreement feels like the ongoing arrangement is fair, a lot of people would rather do that, I think. And I also think quite often I suspect that there is an optimism bias when you decide to go down a path that leads to strike and the strike lasts a long time. The optimism bias being a kind of misjudgment of what your counterpart might agree to and how quickly they might agree to it,
That could
potentially.
be. So in other words, the parties see the work stoppage coming and they think, you know what, it might be a short one. We should hold on to our
Well,
position for
and
now.
they think if I go once we've gone on strike for a day, the relevant management side will surely see and be persuaded that they need to do X, Y, and Z. And I think there is a degree of optimism bias about how that plays out and what it leads to in terms of action from the counterpart.
Well, that's really interesting because when you think about it that way, it goes back to the stop loss bias that we were talking about and the bad bets. So
Yeah.
you made a bad bet, and now there's a work stoppage. You take a look at the situation around you and you think to yourself, you know what, let's continue the bad bet because it's definitely going to get better sometime soon. And yet the conflict continues.
Yeah. And the longer it goes on, I think for some people, and again, not, we can't make any comment about specific cases, but there's a degree of bloody mindedness that is completely human that creeps in. You think, well, I've done it for this long. I'm bloody well going to stick at it.
I think that's exactly right. That's the bloody mindedness you refer to as the stop loss bias in
Yeah.
action, and people tend to double down on bad bets. If there's an important lesson there, it is that when you see the bad bets playing out in a disastrous way, for example, in a work stoppage or in some other negotiation context, you need to get help. You got to reach out for a colleague, friend, advisor, or somebody else who's going to help you think through this, somebody who's outside of the situation and isn't personally affected.
Before we finish, there was another element that I think we wanted to touch on briefly, which was what we call in negotiant language moves away from the table. And that was how the union was able to leverage household names, celebrities, as kind of poster people for the cause. And these celebrities advocated for the union in the public domain, raising the profile of the strike and building public support. That put a lot of pressure on management side. And presumably, the interests of the actors represented by the Screen Actors Guild varied hugely. But that didn't, they did a good job of masking that. And it would be interesting to hear a bit. You were saying some interesting things about this when we talked about it earlier, Josh.
Yeah, it's really interesting how the union was able to organize internally. Your point is excellent. The media is going to cover these poster people, name brand actors. You mentioned Jennifer Aniston, Bryan Cranston. Let me throw in George Clooney and just sort of say, right, anytime any of these folks gets a cup of coffee and forgets their baseball hat and sunglasses, right, the media is going to take a picture of them and report on it. And certainly when they go and walk the picket line, there's going to be some really indelible images that are going to sell clicks and sell papers and sell advertising. And so the media really is all over that. And the idea, of course, was, as you point out, to generate pressure on management. What's so interesting about that entire dynamic, of course, is that a computer generated image of George Clooney versus a computer generated image of the lowest paid actor in Hollywood have completely different implications for those two people, to the point where them being even covered by the same collective bargaining agreement is really, in some ways, wildly divergent and hilarious at that level, right? George Clooney is actually going to care quite a lot about the value of his computer-generated image, not just for this production, but for all future productions. Professionalism, reputation, craft, public image, all of these things go into making one of these poster people, actors at the top of their craft, so successful. And of course, so little of that applies to somebody at the bottom of the scale. And yet, SAG-AFTRA was able to tell their members that control over your computer-generated image is just as important to every actor in this bargaining unit, in this membership, no matter what level of earning or popularity you are. And the membership really bought that, and the union leadership should really be credited with designing that really skillful internal organizing campaign.
Well, and actually, as you say that, I realize there's credit to be given to management side here as well, in that the studios all agreed to act as one, I believe, which made them a much more powerful negotiating bloc in a similar way by pooling their interests and acting together.
That's exactly right. And since they've not been declared monopolists for doing so, we can expect that in the future they'll continue to negotiate as one, as will the membership of the union, of course. And that's an excellent point.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And that's probably a great note to wrap up on. So thanks, Josh. I always enjoy talking to you about this, and I hope we'll do another one soon.
It's always a pleasure, Miranda. Thanks so much for the time today.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.